First, let me introduce myself. I'm Shannon Green. I'm the Executive Director of USAID's Anti-Corruption Task Force and a Senior Advisor to Administrator Power on anti-corruption. We're so pleased to have you all here with us today, and hopefully more folks will be joining to talk about dekleptification. And in just a moment, I will tell you how we're defining dekleptification at USAID. And I will try to not force myself to say that word over and over again because it's a mouthful. But first, let me introduce to you our really remarkable panel that is bringing such a breadth and diversity of experience to this topic. And I really want to make sure that they have sufficient time to shine and to share their experiences, and also to give you all chances to ask questions of them. So starting to my left, we have Max Nefyodov, hopefully I did the V strong enough, who was the first Deputy Minister of Economy in Ukraine from 2015 to 2019, and is the former head of Ukraine's Customs Service. Currently, Max co-leads a project that's dedicated to collecting, investigating, and verifying damages resulting from Russia's aggression in Ukraine. We're so happy to have you, Max. And then to his left, we have Hennie van Vuuren, who is a South African activist and writer. Hennie is the founder and director of Open Secrets, which is based in Cape Town. And Open Secrets seeks accountability for economic crimes, abuse of power, and human rights violations through investigative research and advocacy. And then to his left, we have David Riveros García, who is the executive director of reAcción Paraguay, a grassroots organization dedicated to empowering youth to demand accountability and transparency from their government. And we've heard a lot, I think, over the past couple of days about the importance of youth as really, not even the next generation, but like in the here and now, really being on the front lines of anti-corruption movements. So we're so happy to have you, David. And then to his left, we have Cheryl Stumbris, an old friend and colleague who is a senior foreign service officer at USAID. Cheryl has served in Southern and East Africa. She has a very significant experience in the Foreign Service of over 20 years, including most recently serving as USAID's mission director in Zambia, where I think we can say they're experiencing a window of opportunity when it comes to anti-corruption reform. And Cheryl is currently the Senior Development Advisor at the Foreign Service Institute in Arlington. And then last but not least, we have Tanu Basu, who is the Deputy Director of Thematic Policy Areas at the Open Government Partnership. Tanu is a longtime leader on open government issues in India. She's probably known to many of you, including has served as part of the founding board of the Citizens Vigilance Initiative. So please join me in welcoming and thanking our panel. We will get to them momentarily, but first I thought I would set the scene by just talking through our dekleptification guide and what USAID means by dekleptification and why it is that we have decided to highlight this work. So, starting off with, as part of USAID's first ever anti-corruption policy, which Administrator Power launched on Tuesday, we have decided to take particular aim at kleptocracy as a form of corruption that is most damaging to development and democracy. And why are we doing that? It's because we believe that kleptocracy really does normalize and institutionalize the abuse of power, which gives officials at all levels of government and across all sectors license to operate with impunity. We have defined kleptocracy in the U.S. government as a system in which corruption is allowed to thrive at all levels, from administrative corruption, which could be happening at health clinics or in police stations, all the way up to grand corruption at the highest levels of government. And that is why in the U.S. government we have decided to figure out new ways to root out kleptocracy at its source. And this is the process that we're calling dekleptification. Okay. Of course, it is hard to root out kleptocracy. It wouldn't be kleptocracy if it was shallow or not deeply entrenched. And this is especially true when there are kleptocratic networks that have fully captured the instruments of power and have so sort of permeated every single sector of society, including the private sector. So what we have found in producing this dekleptification guide is that the best chance that we have of shifting these dynamics and changing the governance trajectory is to fully mobilize during what we're calling windows of opportunity, such as after a major corruption scandal really breaks out on the scene and there's a popular mobilization, or where you have a reformist government that is coming into power. These are the moments of elasticity where we really see that there is a chance to make much deeper and more resounding reforms because, the sort of disruption is happening in terms of the government. Okay. So responding to these windows of opportunity for dekleptification require that we move fast and moving quickly. And that's why we wanted to equip officers at USAID, particularly at our missions where most of USAID's work is done as a decentralized agency, as well as those of us back in Washington, to really have a playbook of how to respond where there are these significant openings for anti-corruption reform. And what we did was we gleaned lessons from a number of different places where there had been these kinds of dekleptification windows and consolidated those lessons in the Dekleptification Guide. You can find it online. It was based on 14 different instances of varying success in terms of the durability of the dekleptification, but it was really able to give us some insight into the kinds of interventions that are most helpful and most needed, particularly in order to support those frontline reformers who frankly are doing the hard work of prying open those windows, trying to undertake the reforms, and then trying to keep those windows open when inevitably there is pushback from the forces that are invested in keeping things the way that they are. Okay. So what we found when we did this research and producing the guide was that the most important types of interventions or reforms undertake when there is this significant opening is right in this middle. This window of opportunity, you'll see the chances for reform spike. So how to best take advantage of those spikes. We found that there were 3 kinds of interventions that were really necessary. The first is standing up radically transparent disclosure requirements. So really highlighting and having clarity on who owns what throughout the country's public sector and private sector. The second is standing up strictly independent and impartial accountability bodies like anti-corruption courts or other specialized anti-corruption agencies. And then the third is undertaking structurally inclusive economic growth policies. And that's really about breaking up the monopoly that oligarchs have over the economy and sort of lift up citizens throughout the country and give them a stake in economic growth. To succeed, these reforms have to happen fast and they have to happen deeply. What we found was, that there is this window of about 18 to 24 months after one of these openings happen. And that is the time to really be able to get really significant, deep reforms in place. If we do not seize that window, it oftentimes closes as sort of the forces of corruption and kleptocracy are allowed to regroup. What that means for USAID is that we are trying to get more nimble, we're trying to become more responsive, but we can't turn on a dime. So I think the other important thing to highlight is what we're doing in the lead up to a window, because sometimes you never know where that's going to emerge. And what the guide tells us is that it's really important to have ongoing nuanced political analysis so that we really understand the environment, we understand the networks that are operating, and we are deeply engaged in supporting civil society and the media those kinds of interventions are pivotal to making sure that if and when a window opens, we're able to take the most advantage of it and support frontline reformers. To this end, we are developing what we're calling a ConOps, a concept of operations for responsiveness, and it's really about how do we mobilize support for frontline reformers, not just programmatic support, but diplomatic support, communication support. How do we make sure that our public platforms are responsive to what's going on in country? In some cases, that might mean Samantha Power, traveling to a certain country and just showing solidarity and interest. In other cases, it might mean, using social media and other things to sort of cheer on and champion reformers. In some cases, it might be coming in and sort of using our diplomatic muscle to intervene when those reformers are threatened or different officials try to remove them from power. So at USAID, we are trying to think beyond just our programmatic responses and think about that whole suite of ways that the entire U.S. government can engage to support these windows of opportunity. And that is something we have committed to. We committed to it in the policy. We are on sort of the starting line, or maybe a little bit past the starting line. So it's definitely a work in progress that is challenging us to change our systems and business model, but we are committed to doing just that. And this Dekleptification guide really does underscore the importance of that. So before turning to the panelists for reactions, I did want to share a quick anecdote from my recent trip to Zambia. I had the pleasure to spend a week there just last month, and I met with a range of change makers from government and civil society. For those of you who aren't tracking closely, last year's election saw a really unprecedented turnout where a lot of people came out in support of change. They really wanted to sort of turn the tide on what had become jaw-dropping levels of corruption. And so they ushered in a new opposition candidate, Hakainde Hichilema, who had been detained 15 times and who had pledged to reverse a decade or more of democratic backsliding and really entrenched corruption. We are working very hard at USAID to support the government in a variety of ways, and Cheryl was on the front lines of that and can talk about that more. But the process of dekleptification in Zambia is going to face some real hurdles, and that's because from about 2011 to 2021, the former government racked up nearly $20 billion in debt, most of which there's nothing to show for it because of the just absolute gross, blatant levels of corruption, much of which is held by Chinese financiers. An infamous example of that, this kept coming up during my trip, was the example of FTJ University. The government paid $33 million to a Chinese firm to build this public university in Mansa, but a brick was never laid. There is nothing to show for $33 million, no construction, nothing, and that is just but one example of just the grotesque level of corruption that was happening in the former administration and how debt just absolutely skyrocketed, leaving the population, with this burden of debt, but without the public infrastructure and services. Sadly, this is all too common, as we've heard throughout the week, in terms of the collusion between domestic forces and foreign forces, really working together to co-opt and capture all of the levers of power in the government and economy, and making it very difficult to sort of unwind and pull this back. But we know that it's necessary. We know that we have partners around the world who are taking the courageous steps to dekleptify their systems, and we at USAID really want to be standing by their side, helping them through this process, and that is what dekleptification is all about. So, with that, I'm going to turn to our panelists, and we're going to start with you, Max, given how much of the guide is really drawing on examples from Ukraine and other post-Soviet cases. So you came into government, as I understand it, right after the Revolution of Dignity, and we're confronting, I think it's fair to say, some of the most entrenched corruption that there probably is anywhere in the world. including in procurement, which we know is a source of a lot of corruption. So I was just wondering, do the lessons in the guide resonate with your experience? In what ways or not? So let's turn it over to you, Max.
Hello, everyone. First of all, I want to thank all of you who came here so early in the morning to talk about maybe not the most sexy topic in the world, dekleptification. But I do hope that you can learn something from it, from those successes and maybe a couple of mistakes that were made in Ukraine and that are cited in the great guide prepared and by USAID, and which can basically be the basis for this further work in many other countries. And we would definitely love to learn from your experience, maybe at the next conference in a couple of years. Speaking about Ukraine, I have a relatively unorthodox approach to anti-corruption activities because I came from the business side of the world. I'm actually an investment banker by education. And I tried to look at it as a behavioral problem because very often it is viewed as an issue of a couple of bad guys. There are bad politicians or there are bad oligarchs and they force the whole country, millions upon millions of people, into some kind of unhealthy economic relationships, bribery, and so on and so on. Usually the situation is more difficult than that. Usually there is the whole ecosystem of politicians, businesses, investors, and sometimes even lowly recipients and rank-and-file officials that actually benefit from this situation and actually consider it normal and something that cannot be changed. And the system is geared in such a way so that it motivates them to behave in such a way. And we always need to think not only about the direct losses from corruption, basically bribes or some kind of misuse of power, but also about indirect losses, which sometimes are at least a multitude higher than what is directly stolen. This results from inefficient economic decisions. This results from unfair distribution of resources, of barring access to economic relations to different groups of actors, especially disenfranchised actors, for example, in Ukraine, about like women in business or internally displaced people or veterans, and there may be other groups in other countries, obviously. So when you're looking at it, you always need to look at it as some kind of behavioral problem. What can be done to motivate people to behave in another way? One of the interesting examples that I actually found was that economic lessons work. I mean, I'm actually educated in economic doctrine, and you read all these textbooks and you consider them theory, and then you apply them in real life and say, wow, you know, auctions work. They really work. I mean, if you do anonymous auctions, you read it, you know, in some kind of Nobel Prize winner speech, you apply the same lessons, and wow, they work. This might seem like a joke or anecdote for you, but actually this is something that many people forget about and forget that there are recipes to many problems. It is just that, first of all, they need to be applied wisely and pragmatically, and second, they might give not those very easy and convenient answers that, hey, there are a couple of bad guys and we just need to jail them or like drive them out of the politics and so on. Another very important issue is to understand that all the changes require the coalition of people who basically benefit of it. So it's also very important to build this coalition and to try to find those segments in business, in civil society, in general population, just average taxpayer who actually benefits from the reform. Because otherwise, you're absolutely right, it's very difficult to fight the entrenched kleptocrats. They usually have the resources, the power, the media to attack you, sometimes in a much more devious and inventive ways than just jail you or open a criminal case against you to create a martyr out of it. Very often, unfortunately, it's much worse, and it's very difficult to live in this life of, you know, of death of 1,000 cuts. So this coalition building, like Ukraine's experience shows, is extremely important. I mean, if you can't just tell who benefits from your reform, from your change, usually it is going to fail. This also includes, for example, transparency for the sake of transparency. So you always need to understand that while, of course, we all advocate for open data and everything that is in the guide, but you also need to understand that data by itself is worthless. It's meaningful when someone benefits from it, someone can work with it, and someone can turn it into tangible results. So whereas systems or business intelligence module or something like this was built in Ukraine in order to allow access to it and allow actually usage of this information, be it for commercial reasons, such as, for example, just commercial intelligence, checking your counterparts, whether it is owned by potentially crude government official or whether it participated in some tenders that were criminally contested and so on. Well, that's a value. That's a value for many businesses. They use it and they turn this open data into a real weapon. If it's just some kind of a data set, maybe big, brilliant data set, but it sits on a government website and no one ever looks into it or even doesn't have a method to look into it, then unfortunately it's not a big win. And the third thing that I always urge people to think about is actually what changed or what new resources are available to promote this change. Because again, maybe that's a very business-like approach, but as any startup that wants to disrupt some kind of a market needs to answer this question. I mean, what changed? Why is it so wrong? I mean, did my predecessors were all stupid or completely crooked, and I'm the first ever honest and clever guy to come here? Probably it's not true. I mean, probably you are overextending yourself. So, but usually there is an answer. Like in many cases, there is technological progress that allows to build systems, legislation, or some kind of solutions or data access that was not available before. And this includes to all the aspects that were mentioned: transparency, accountability, and so on. So this is also like maybe the last, but maybe the most important point that I'd like to raise. There are many innovative IT solutions. There are many digital systems that, for example, are working and were tested in Ukraine that are, again, theoretically very well defined, including literally by Nobel Prize winners in their respective areas, and that actually work. And they can be transplanted to other countries relatively fast. I mean, mind you, it's still a challenge, but this is something that can be done much, much faster and easier than, say, retraining thousands of government officials or running thousands of transparent selection contests or something like this. And actually, our successes, for example, in public procurement that were mentioned, and by independent accounts we were able to cut corruption risks in public procurement at least twice. They actually were based on very radical transformation to e-procurement. This is something that even many developed countries still lack, but which can be done, I mean, basically anywhere in the world within 1 or 2 years. And it brings civil society, it brings potential reformers in the government new tools and weapons that potentially can at least equalize this fighting field with kleptocracy.
Max, thank you so much for all that, and just thank you for being here. I think there's a lot of solidarity that everyone in this room is showing with you in Ukraine at this moment, so thank you so much. Next, I'm going to turn to Hennie, who had a front row seat to these dynamics in South Africa in the early days of President Ramaphosa's administration. So Hennie, your country was working quite hard to disentangle itself from the corruption of the Zuma era. I'd be really grateful to learn what were some of the biggest lessons from that period, and then any other reflections that you have, on the dekleptification guide or process.
Great, thanks very much, Shannon. we're going to choose an easier word than dekleptification next time around. We struggle to get our tongues around it. But it's good to be here, and yeah, thanks very much. And I think congratulations to USAID for this guide, which is very helpful, and I think is a helpful, in a way, reflection and talking back to work that organizations like Transparency International did 20 years ago when they spoke about new anti-corruption governments. And I think there was a reflection in the early 2000s. I remember there was a meeting in Nairobi where we looked at the idea in countries like Kenya and South Africa and Georgia, if I recall correctly, of how one can try and tackle change in these moments of transition. So South Africa's been through, I think what's kind of interesting to reflect on, reading through the guide, is in a way we've been through some of this before, and we've been through our phases of change and these moments of opportunity. I think we had a very important one in the late 1990s as a democratic country under the administration of Nelson Mandela, establishing the rule of law, democratic constitution, and creating many of the rules and the laws that were put in place. Our experience was one, and I'm going to come to the state capture and your question. Our experience was one that we were very quickly corrupted by the late 1990s by a group of European arms companies who sought to undermine the democratic government in South Africa and effectively helped set in process a system of corruption which led ultimately to the administration of Jacob Zuma. Effectively, French companies like Thales bet on Jacob Zuma. They said, we're going to bribe this man, not because he's powerful right now, but he will stop prosecutions against us in future. Today, Jacob Zuma is in court together with Thales in South Africa, and there are elements of the rule of law that are strong, and it shows how you have to be in this for the long game. But our most recent period of state capture, and these are the ebbs and flows, I think, of the challenges we face, was from approximately 2012 to 2017, 2018. It was a system of looting from the state. It was politically driven. We call it state capture. I guess you could call it a system of kleptocracy in its broader sense. And I think we need to get to understand what we mean by kleptocracy. Unpack a little bit by what we mean by kleptocracy. But it's a system of looting that resulted in a loss of approximately $80 to $100 billion from the South African state. It drove about 2 million people into poverty from what we can tell at the very least, and it resulted in a wholesale destruction of most of our state-owned enterprises. Our railways, our commuter railway lines, our energy supply, our centralized energy supply. Yesterday we had 8 hours of power blackouts in South Africa. Commuters who were 500,000 to 1 million commuters who were using train lines to go to work every day. Those trains simply aren't running any longer. And so it's a complex story of what resulted in it. Now, I think in South Africa, thinking through it, I think there are 4 elements that have been really important for us, and some of them haven't actually worked out, but I think are worth noting. The one is an element of truth-telling, and I think the guide talks to that. How do you draw together the facts? We've had a commission of inquiry led by our now Chief Justice of the Constitutional Court, which has sat for 3 years, amassed literally tens of thousands of pages of documents in a report which tells the full scope and story of how state capture infiltrated every aspect of public life. And it's an important reckoning with the truth, given the disinformation that's driven by the actors, most of whom remain free and are not in prison, who are implicated in state capture. And they often work with foreign governments when it interests those governments. They certainly have, whether that's interests in Russia or other countries as well. So I think it's just an establishing the truth, I think, is incredibly important. And for that, we've relied on the work of investigative journalists, on the work of civil society organizations who forensically pull together that information, bring it to the commission, and the commission itself does that work independently. And I think that truth-telling element is very important. Our second, I think, lesson has been the importance of moving quickly, and I think it's something you speak to in the guide. So one of our challenges is that we had a president from the same governing party, Cyril Ramaphosa, who is still president of South Africa today, who was elected by his party to be the leader of South Africa, and ultimately by the South African people. His party was put back in government, really driven in by an understanding that there was a need for change, and that change would come from within the African National Congress. And so he had an enormous amount of political capital to spend very quickly. And unfortunately, the lesson from South Africa is that if you try and play the Game of Thrones, you're going to end up in the fantasy land, because you've got to move quickly, and you've got to basically you have to use all the levers of power you have to try and find a way to move all the people implicated in graft out of your inner circle. The idea of keeping everybody in the tent because you're going to retain power that way simply hasn't. The lesson from South Africa is it hasn't worked. We've almost in a state of gridlock in our ability to hold some of the very powerful politicians who are implicated in state capture to account. And it's not a question of us being re-corrupted as a state. It's a question of inertia that develops. And I think that's about why moving quickly is important. Then the third element is you've got to clean up the police and the anti-corruption authorities. And I think, again, what we've seen, and the prosecuting authorities more generally. So our big challenge is that our police service and the country's anti-corruption unit is still filled with basically the dregs of state capture, individuals who were implicated very deeply in crimes that weren't moved out of their positions. And in a similar way, our prosecuting authority has not moved out all of the corrupt prosecutors that were implicated in state capture. The result of that is that there's a slow grind in holding these elites to account. The result of that, of course, is that it creates an internal dissatisfaction among citizens and a kind of a cashing out of the democratic process. Fewer people are voting. So the importance of those reforms are crucial. And then if I can then, Shannon, maybe just to move to the last point, and this is, I think, a question I didn't see, maybe I missed it, and maybe it's something that the guide can look at in a potential future iteration. I was thinking a lot about denazification, in fact. So if you think about the struggle against fascism in the middle of the 20th century, as a concept, in many ways, and I'm not going to go into the details of it, I think one of the areas in which that process was particularly unsuccessful was to look at the profiteers of fascism in Europe in the mid-20th century, who were the big corporations, who were the very wealthy individuals who made cash out of the murder of millions of people. And in a way, I think we're missing a beat when we look at these issues in the same way that's happened in South Africa. And it is the role of the big corporations who've made money off state capture. It's seen as an intrinsically South African project, and it's not. The capture of South Africa was a global project in which global corporations feasted. Those 2 million people that have been driven into poverty have been driven into poverty by companies like KPMG and Bain that are based in the United States. Bain was central for a mere $10 million, was central to the destruction of South Africa's revenue authority, a revenue authority that became the model for revenue authorities around the African continent. The result was the state wasn't able to draw in resources in the way that they should from the fiscus, and we lost about $8 billion in public revenues because the way in which the revenue service was destroyed by Bain working closely with corrupt officials was to say, stop your ability to tax big corporations and powerful tobacco and other cartels. Now, that isn't because Bain wanted to make money from them. They wanted to make money from a group of other crooks. But Bain has not been prosecuted in the United States. I've not heard that there's a proper investigation. McKinsey was central to the destruction of South Africa's Electricity Supply Commission and of its goods railway network. There has not been, now McKinsey faces prosecution in South Africa. They made fees of about $100 million in South Africa. McKinsey has not been prosecuted. And we can talk about China, North and South Rail, a Chinese state-owned company, central to state capture. And of course, they act with complete impunity, and all the auditors, PwC, KPMG, Deloitte, these are companies that have acted in a deeply criminal manner, and they have been complicit with the crimes of state capture. So it brings me, and we can go on. We can talk about T-Systems and ABB and others. The point being, in my closing point, is that if we are going to get serious about tackling things in this window of opportunity, we need to work together across borders. We need to see the US justice system, the justice system in Germany, in the United Kingdom, and other places working in lockstep with these very fragile regimes in countries like South Africa. Right now, that isn't happening. It's failed South Africa in this process very clearly, and it's failing other countries, and I think that's what we've got to face up to. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hennie, for being very provocative, but also for pulling out, I think, some really important points about the nonlinear nature of dekleptification, the role of the private sector and companies, the need to really work across borders, including on law enforcement, asset recovery, and other issues, as well as really bringing to light, I think, the human cost of corruption. That's all really important. And I think, David, that this is a good segue to you, coming from the experience of Paraguay and thinking about those ebbs and flows, right? And whether and how we capitalize when there are windows of opportunity, and then what to do when those windows dissipate. So I'm hoping that you can shed some light on where you see Paraguay in terms of those windows, and if you think there are lessons from the guide that resonate with your experience.
Definitely. Well, it's an honor to be here sharing this panel with you. I've been given the youth card, although during the opening, this is my third IACC, and when they asked the under 30 to stand up, and I didn't, I said, so this is how it feels. so it is a thing, but honestly, since I'm talking about that, one of the questions that I've been having in the past few days, as being my third IACC, and seeing that we are growing older, is where are we going? The whole will for change and anti-corruption that we inherited, are we passing that? Are we identifying new champions, new leaders that organize? Because we have also talked a lot about collective action in different panels. And collective action, if we really mean it, it's grassroots, it's sustained collective action, it engages people, and it turns that into pressure that increases political costs so that transformations are possible. So that's one of my questions, that, taking this youth card opportunity. In terms of Paraguay, so Paraguay had two windows of opportunity. The first one was over 15 years ago, when for the first time in half a century, Paraguay had a different party leading the government. It was such a great, and this is where it resonates already with the guideline, the book that you wrote. Civil society had mobilized, and the moment government took place, so this was an opposition government for the first time, unheard of in Paraguay, civil society became sort of neutral. Most of the people leading civil society organizations became ministers. This is when my organization was also born, so this also translates into hope for people in the grassroots. I was 17 years old. I led a mass demonstration against corruption, mobilizing 3,000 people. I almost went to jail a few times. So with the question of how can a country say it is fighting corruption if its next generation is being educated by corrupt people, we started reAcción. For the first years, we sold pizza to finance our activities. Now we're present in the 3 largest cities in Paraguay, enabling monitoring mechanisms that are currently provide transparency to about $45 million annually, and we led the reform of the national procurement policy in the education sector. So those achievements, when we talk about youth, and we tend to tokenize youth, and to make an analogy with blockchain, we speculate with that token, but we never really peg that token to reality. Youth has been always one of the groups that open windows of opportunity. And then they're taken away from the discussion. And again, we talk about the future and the present. And as someone who was here when I was 21, I am kind of tired of listening to people and the applause that we're still giving to the whole youth discourse, if you will. Because I've been here for long enough, and nothing has, and I'm now getting older, and I don't see that structural change in the way we approach youth. Which takes me to the second window of opportunity in Paraguay, which ironically started with a massacre, a de facto political coup in Paraguay, where, as you probably know, the State Department has recently designated the former president of Paraguay, Horacio Cartes, as significantly corrupt for a variety of reasons. He was actually, ironically, the one who pushed for transparency reforms, because after this massacre, society in general demanded transparency and accountability. And USAID was, I cannot exaggerate when I'm saying this, without USAID support, there would be no transparency reforms, no right to information law in Paraguay, and open government portals. Right now, we are in a regression. So let me then go to the things that I think I could share that we have learned. Transparency is a two-sided sword. This is something I mentioned in a different panel earlier. Horacio Cartes pushed a lot of information, like Max has mentioned. A lot of information was in the public. But transparency reforms can also be used to enforce corruption, because when citizens now have evidence and they denounce corruption with evidence in their hands, being that, a contract or data, analyzed data, and still impunity remains unchallenged, that's a way for the powerful to say, not even with the evidence and the data you can touch. So my power is absolute. And that makes people feel even powerless in the face of that. So all of that is something that I clearly remember from that window of opportunity we had in Paraguay during Horacio Cartes' government. The second is that in civil society, and especially the transparency and anti-corruption community, we should not make the anti-corruption discourse, the anti-corruption rhetoric, become the anti-politics discourse. We really have to promote constructive conflict. And that's so hard for us because our credibility is linked to our ability to be, in a way, if that exists, neutral towards politicians, towards the people who now take the reforming position within government. Constructive conflict is, in my understanding of it, is really working with government, hitting them hard whenever they fail, but showing them that we will be there to transfer all that we know and support them in such a way that we build trust. This is how my organization has worked closely with the Ministry of Education and the National Procurement Directorate for years to enact the national policy reforms that I mentioned earlier. And I have a quick anecdote. During the pandemic, the Ministry of Education in Paraguay conditioned school lunches to students finishing their classwork, which is nonsense. So we made a very viral illustration of the minister as a clown. It went viral. It was in the media and the newspapers picked it up. That same week, we were having meetings from 8 to 10 p.m. with the Ministry of Education's cabinet to develop this app that now allows for the real-time monitoring. So that's the level of trust. They know that we will hit. They also know that we want sincerely and wholeheartedly to help them build something better, to solve a problem. The third that I already touched a bit upon is the collective action problem. And the tendency, the incentives these days, they are there for us to try to, I feel like, save us the trouble of being citizens by using technology. Technology, and this is in the literature, can also disintermediate when we're not really understanding the ecosystems in which we're working with them. And when we disintermediate using technology, then the gap we're trying to bridge, the assumptions we make that people's demand will be turned into some type of service delivery improvement will not happen. This is why we have so many zombie apps, great applications that incorporate artificial intelligence and other tools, machine learning, but nobody uses them. So this is also why we spent 8 years working with community with the daunting task of just dealing with people, which is inefficient, it is ineffective, it is not office hours, it is beyond that. But if we're true to including people, if we want to match the rhetoric we use to the grassroots work that is needed, then those are the times and those are the methods through which we can reach some type of change. Later on, because I know that we have a lot of discussion to talk about, but I really want to touch upon the funding structures that the international community gives. I think there are negative externalities, unintended ones, beyond the very positive effects, as I mentioned in the case of Paraguay, that make very large amounts of money from donors like USAID, like the World Bank, and others, when they concentrate and when their thresholds are so high, and they concentrate on a few civil society organizations, I give the analogy that that becomes like giving something so much mass that it creates and generates its own gravitational pull. And civil society starts to circle around that like satellites. This inhibits civil society from other civil society organizations from pursuing their missions, from developing local capacity at the community level. So when the international financing is over, we get a broken civil society fighting each other for scrambles. This has happened in Paraguay, and we don't get new organizations. In Paraguay, it took about 2 decades until new organizations like mine were born. And this goes to my first question, and this is how I conclude. What is the generational gap we're having at this conference? Are we going to wait a decade or two until we get new youth-led organizations or younger people in new leadership positions for the anti-corruption struggle to continue? So I'll be really happy to continue on that and how political parties now are pushing for a new window of opportunity in Paraguay. But I'm really, really glad to be able to mention these here. Thank you, Shannon.
David, I don't know how Cheryl's going to follow that, but nevertheless, it is her task to follow that. But I honestly wanted to pull a thread that you mentioned, which is the importance of civil society persistently engaging even when the window opens. I think all too often you see like, we mobilized, we did the work, we brought the reformist government into power, and sort of like, now you take the reins. And I think the example that you provided of like both hitting hard and being critical and staying on top of things while also being constructive is such an interesting point. So Cheryl, in a couple of minutes, I'd love for you to reflect on your experience in Zambia and elsewhere, and in particular as a donor. How do you think that USAID and potentially other bilateral donors could be more responsive and do a better job supporting frontline actors when windows of opportunity emerge?
Great. Thanks, Shannon. And let me just say what a distinct honor it is to be here today. Hennie made me laugh because I was a youngish democracy officer in Kenya 20-some years ago when we were talking about anti-corruption at that point in time. So this is a crowd that has inspired my entire career, and I want to thank you all for your service. There's nothing more important that you do. There's nothing that has given me more pride to support, and I think this guide will provide that exact passion in the next group of democracy officers from the U.S. government. So I just want to thank you for all that you do every single day. So I thought I would talk, kind of trying to make 3 points. I know we're super short on time, and the people around me have much more interesting things to say. But I do like to remind people that, you know, we talk about capacity, limited capacity in a new government after a transition, limited capacity in civil society. I think you should also remember that the diplomatic community has limited capacity. So, and I think it's important to remember that we don't know there's going to be a transition. Oh, I'm still, okay, sorry. They told me not to move the mic before, so I was So we don't know when there's going to be this transition, obviously. And I just want to share that in the diplomatic world, those people that are working on the elections generally tend to be the same group of people that are working on anti-corruption. So they can be a little distracted because all eyes are on the prize of that democratic transition. So getting in early with scenario planning is super important, actually. And I say to all civil society organizations, you need to be the thought leader for the diplomatic community. Your information is better, your connections are better, your knowledge is better. So you need to get in early with them and push them to be thinking through the scenarios in either case of where the election outcome is. And following that up by really co-designing programs, that's something we're trying to do in the development world much more, co-designing programs that are flexible enough to respond to either scenario. So if it gets more repressive, you have one avenue to go down, and if you have a window, you have another avenue to go down. And that way you can be positioned to act much quicker, which must happen in these short windows of opportunity. Also, in the development world, we really need to encourage, kind of building on what you were saying actually, we have to keep pushing civil society organizations to be building that next generation of leaders and finding new organizations. We know, going back 20-some years, that when we have this big democratic transition, we're going to lose a lot of civil society to the government. So where are those watchdogs going to be? How are they going to relate? They're not used to, you know, these are, you know, their colleagues that are now in government. They're not used to being a watchdog. We really need to continue pushing that next generation to promote accountability. You know, also for donors to support the government in action, you know, it's no surprise that window is so short. We need to push government to do the hardest thing first. The thing that is most politically unpalatable to their own cabinet, that has to happen first for transparency. Because as we lose time in this window, it's going to be very hard to get those kinds of things done. And then supporting them to be very public in making a stance about transparency, whether it's asset declaration or something similar, very quick. Everyone in my cabinet is making this declaration. Here the information is to send that signal. And then it has to be coupled with some really short wins to keep the public on their side. From the donor side, for the U.S. government particularly, I think the key is we need to do more pre-positioning on transparency where we have funds. So our health programs, that is where the U.S. government currently invests in development. Our health programs have to have better anti-corruption, transparency, and accountability mechanisms, whether it's procurement reform, whether it's, you know, diverting goods that are being sold privately. That is where our resources are. We have to come in behind where we can put our resources to promote transparency. And we have to focus on the economics of it. Donors need to do everything they can to promote economic recovery or create jobs during that window, because the long-term sustainability of anti-corruption efforts need the citizens to be on board and getting that democracy dividend. So the multi-sector thing for the development partners and the government, all of our partners, is focusing on economic recovery for youth in particular. And then it is all about messaging also. We know how strong the powers within and the people who are benefiting from corruption can fight back. So early messaging, transparency for the governments and civil society of what is going on and why and what is moving is critically important. So Shannon, I'm going to stop there because I know how great everyone has things to say, and I don't want to take too much time, but happy to take any follow-on questions. Thanks again.
Thanks, Cheryl. I'm really glad that you pulled out a couple of the really key points in terms of the economics. And so we are tying this agenda to debt restructuring and how do we crowd in quality private investment to make sure that these windows of opportunity deliver across a multitude of domains, including the economic sphere and oftentimes jobs, right? So youth have mobilized, they want jobs, they have expectations, and we need to deliver short-term gains even while we're doing the longer-term work and making sure that the government is clearly messaging that to the population to keep people sort of on side and patient with the reform process. So Tanu, this is where you come in. So you have this bird's eye view from your perch at OGP and have seen a number of windows be sustained and deliver. You've seen others collapse. So I'm really curious about if there's anything that you wanted to pick up on in terms of opportunities and how we can be more responsive and support reformers, but also importantly, what can we learn from when we weren't able to fully capitalize on those windows, and are there blind spots that you think we've missed in this conversation thus far?
Thanks, Shannon, and this is really a tough act to follow. I was furiously taking notes as everyone was speaking because it was fascinating and inspiring. And thank you to you, Shannon, and the team at USAID for putting this conversation together and the guide. Now I think I'll follow Cheryl's act and sort of go in a pattern of three, because I think there's a lot we can chew on and learn from people in the room thereafter after the panel finishes. So the first thing I think I want to pick up on is the window of opportunity and the reform, the pace of reforms. I know, Hennie said it is important to go in quick. And it is important to show some quick wins, and others said that too. I think what I think has seemed to have worked well is balancing the the quick wins with longer term planning to strengthen institutions. I mean, as we all know, the big challenge after a transition is stabilization of, things are still very much in flux, people are threatened, economically, there are challenges. So how do you show some quick wins while balancing longer-term reform, especially in terms of strengthening institutions like the judiciary, like the police force, like procurement authorities, like, so systems that are essential infrastructure for anti-corruption. And within that, how do you show a couple of quick wins, but big ticket wins? Because everything cannot be reformed all at once. So what are those one or two big ticket things you really want to see, right? And here, the Ukrainian example that Max shared is important, right? We all talk about Prozoro so many years after. And why do we talk about Prozoro so many years after? Because I think that was an important system that was built from ground up. Now, I don't think it was possible to build multiple systems from ground up, but then there was that big ticket win. In a few other contexts, so right now, currently, I don't know if there's anyone from Honduras who's in the room, but Honduras has had an important transition recently. And, something that's happening, which is an interesting one to watch, it's not a happy ending yet, but an interesting one to watch is there is an anti-corruption strategy that is being developed. And in addition to that, there's a roadmap for some quick wins, and, including through the OGP action plan that's in play. So there is a long-term strategy that they are discussing while recognizing that in the short term, 1 or 2 years, what it is that they want to see. And I think that is a really interesting interplay to follow. So I think that's the first point. The second point, which again several of my fellow panelists touched on, is protection of civil society, journalists, and others, right? It was fantastic to see USAID's sort of SHIELD program. I think that is a really important acknowledgement of the kinds of threats that civil society face, certainly before the political turmoil and whatever the transition follows, but more importantly after. There is a sense that once the transition takes place, everything is better, things are looking rosier, and actually, when those vested interests are threatened, very often civil society is threatened once even the new government is put in place, and there are attacks there. So again, what can be done to empower individual reformers, but identify sort of new leaders in the community? I think that's an important thing for us to think about. And also, at the same time, provide sort of match skills, match talent, and help build those coalitions. We talk about building coalitions like people will stand in a room and find like-minded people at once. That does happen, but that does take time, as all of you very well know from the work that you are doing. So I think, how do you look at really big challenges like tackling disinformation that's at a high when the transition happens? How do you look at independent news media and building independent news media when change happens while empowering civil society? And that's something I think we've seen greatly affect how the transition is successful or not. In Malawi, civil society is really playing an important role, but we also know journalists are threatened every day. In Moldova, we see activists, anti-corruption activists in particular, be threatened. In Ukraine, even before the war, Max, how much anti-corruption activists, journalists, and others were threatened every step of the way. So again, not just during the transition, but after the transition, how is civil society, how are journalists and activists protected, is an important point to think about. And finally, I think when we're talking about reforms and the reform agenda, when we're talking about anti-corruption, how do we push for co-creation with citizens at the local level? I think that's a very important point that you, David, brought up. It is really good to see the international donor community talk about localization. In OGP, we talk very greatly about domestic accountability. It's important that international commitments are made, but there is a strong infrastructure for domestic accountability. But how do we build that? How do we build that after a moment of transition, that political window of opportunity that the guide talks about really nicely? I think it's an important way to see how can certain systems for co-creation be curated, can be supported, and what kind of ecosystem can be built around that, right? So in Dominican Republic, and I know that's one of the case studies talked about, I don't know if there's someone in the room who wants to share their experience. I think how civil society and government are working together is an important way. But again, how do we go beyond that elite civil society layer, which David talked about, and really go down and build systems in place that eventually involve citizens, I think is incredibly important to sustain reforms that go beyond the capital city, that go beyond, the first couple of years of the international community looking at a country. Because, let's be honest, crises happen in other places and then the international community forgets the country and moves on, right? So how do you build systems and really include citizens in that conversation is, I think, something we need to think more about. Thanks, Shannon.
Amazing. Well, I am not going to take the moderator's prerogative to ask additional questions because I think the panel discussion has been so rich and so thought-provoking, but I know that there's also a wealth of experience in the room. So I really want to use the balance of our time to open things up to comments and questions in the room. I think what we'll do is take 3 interventions at a time. If you want to direct your question at a specific person on the panel, that's great. If you want to ask it more generally, that's fine too. But please do keep your interventions short so that we can take as many as possible. So let's start with you, Frank. And do we have a microphone? Is this the microphone that's supposed to be passed around? Or speak loudly, I don't know. Here you go. Okay.
Thank you very much. My name is Frank Vogel. David, I will retire very soon and hand over to a younger generation. I'm a co-founder of Transparency International, which really makes me very old, and the chairman of the Partnership for Transparency Fund. First, I'll be very, very short. I have a specific question. But I want to congratulate you, Sharon, and your colleagues. No aid agency that I know of since we started TI 30 years ago, almost exactly 30 years ago, has been so supportive and so clear about supporting civil society in anti-corruption. This is a landmark, and I hope this policy will now be translated into many aid agencies, and that's where my question comes. The elephants that are not in the room, and if there is somebody in the room from the World Bank, please stand up. Is there somebody from the IMF here, or the Asian Development Bank, or the IDB? These are the elephants in the room. IDA, the soft window of the World Bank, plans to give $93 billion of grants in the next 3 years cycle. And there is as yet not a single word in the IDA directives supporting civil society. You talked about economics and debt. There is not a single effort by the IMF in actually involving civil society in developing programs for debt-distressed countries. They talk to them afterwards. So, what are your recommendations, taking all of your experience and all of the support you have just given to civil society and want to give? What are your recommendations that we can take from here to the World Bank, the IMF, and the multilaterals? Thank you very much indeed.
Let's go to Liz, and then we'll come over here.
Thank you very much. My name is Liz Hart. I'm been around the anti-corruption community for ever too long as well. But I've done something recently that's giving me a new perspective on that, and that's that I'm now working within the conservation community. And so I've had the experience of trying to translate the lessons of the anti-corruption community to a new set of people for whom this is a very real concern, but not one that they know how to navigate very well yet. So David, I really wanted to appreciate the point that you made about that difficult pathway between being an honest critic and a trustworthy partner at the same time. And one of the things that I'd like to encourage is that first of all, I want to talk to you afterwards, but we are trying to support more efforts for the anti-corruption community and the conservation community to work together to navigate this territory. So I'd love to recruit you into that process as well. We've got a lot of learning to do across these sectors. Second, just an observation from long history in the development world as well. I hope that the messaging that we are making in these transition periods is getting a little more nuanced. I remember a very, very important transition in West Africa nearly 20 years ago now, in which the message was, we're not talking about corruption, the news is only good here. And we know from that particular country that the news was not only good there. So I hope that we also in the development community are becoming better navigators of being honest critics as well as trustworthy partners in that process. And I'll leave my comments there.
Yep, with the white shirt and black vest. Sweater.
Hi, thank you. Cheyenne Sharbatka-Church with the Corruption, Justice, and Legitimacy Program. I really appreciated everyone's comments, and I'll be short. I noticed the lack of anyone commenting on the role of political parties. So not the politicians themselves, but the back office, informal power brokers that, and I'm really hoping that Hennie will talk about it, because in South Africa, not as a South African, but as a follower of South African politics, the role of the political party in state capture seems to be central. So what do we do about the political parties, not necessarily the politicians themselves?
Okay, 2 questions and a comment. Really quickly on Liz's point about working across sectors, that is also something that at USAID we're trying very hard to integrate anti-corruption considerations across sectors. And I just want to underscore, foot stomp that point of coming together and using language and working with our colleagues in other sectors who are really increasingly appreciating the threat that corruption poses to progress in their sectors. But we'll tell you, I got my, MPH in public health. I don't know how to address these transnational criminal organizations that are working in these protected areas, or I don't know how to make sure that commodities don't get leaked out of our supply chain, and I think are hungry for solutions and answers and partnership, and we sort of have to help meet them partway, and that's what we're trying to do. But obviously want to do so in partnership with all of you. So I think we have a couple of questions on the table with the IFEs, political parties, and others. Max, you want to jump in?
Yes, in my stint with the government for 5 years, I was the head of donor coordination in Ukraine as well. So the question about how to motivate different international donors to contribute more to the civil society, is extremely important. But still, I'd like to first of all to start by thanking Transparency International again, because in Ukraine, all the reforms, or many of the reforms we've been talking about, Prozoro and Prozoro Sale and many others, they, even from the legal point of view, they were born inside Transparency International. The software was developed there, and then after several cycles of improvements was gradually transferred to the ownership of the state. And one of the reasons for this is not only because the guys at TI are great, that goes without saying, but also because from the legal standpoint, that was the fastest thing for the donors to support. And I think there are 2 points from my experience, maybe it's different in other countries, is that first of all, it's very important to have a coalition to address many of the more powerful MDBs like those, like the World Bank and the IMF mentioned. They have the specific mandate, and they are not used to talking to just individual experts or individual activists. That's something that is very alien to them. That's something they don't know how to incorporate to their work. They don't know how to use or what is the best way to use all the conditionality in their programs to support this agenda. They're often bombarded by different conflicting requests from different parts of civil society, more radical people, less radical people, all those thin lines between being a critic and being a partner, and so on and so on. So it's very important to have a coalition to present the views and not just individual requests or something like this. And the second issue is that speed matters. Speed matters more than size in Ukrainian experience. One of the issues that we always urged donors to do is to allocate some amount of funds to the rapid response financing. If I can have a short anecdote about failures in Ukrainian reforms. Shannon mentioned I had a short period as a head of Ukraine's customs. And that when I came, that was somewhat unexpected position for me. So when I came here, I was not that well prepared for it. And one of the first things I found was that USAID and many other donors had a legal ban on working with Ukrainian fiscal system because it was so notoriously corrupt. So no one ever wanted even to touch it. So you had zero access to any funds that could have been used for reforms, for hiring new people, for buying new software, for bringing expertise from other countries, and so on. And unlocking all of it took so long that the first money came after I was gone, which was probably not the best situation for the donors as well, because now they were stuck with an organization that was, again, not very willing to talk to them. So please, from the civil society, I think we should be better organized to address especially big donors that maybe are not very well accustomed to working with this side of the world. But from the donor side, please allocate funds that can use this window of opportunity. Because if the window of opportunity comes, but we are in the set of this multi-year planning process and outcome metrics design, then sorry, the window of opportunity will be long gone by the time we are ready to react. Thank you so much.
Yes, I'd like to try to answer your question in terms of recommendations in my perception. So first, self-criticism. I know I do not ignore the difficulty in terms of fundraising that we all face for each of our organizations, and how it is simpler and more effective to present a proposal to USAID or to the Transparency International, to the World Bank. But the more we're dependent on international donors, the more we are independent from local communities. And I think we need to do more work trying to get community funding. And I know this sounds romanticized and it sounds idealistic. I know it's really hard work. Most of our countries do not have a high percentage of people with access to banks to even donate money. But this is something we should pursue. In terms of donors, going back to the allegory or the analogy that I use with physics, international donors should know that their funding can create stars or can turn dying stars into black holes. And that breaks civil society. I already mentioned the incentives that a lot of money generates. So it would be great to have the World Bank that currently cannot. They have the GPSA program, which is very, point every few years and every sectors, and only certain countries can apply. But it would be great to have more of those. And then here I want to pause and just talk about administrative capacity and thresholds. My organization cannot apply, honestly, to grants that are $200,000 and above, because the requirement in terms of administrative capacity are really high. So when you talk, and this is logic, I'm not saying that this is intentional on the side of the donors. It's easier to monitor taxpayers' money, which is what is funding our work, to be honest. It's easier to monitor that when you only have 1 or 2 NGOs in a country reporting. It's crazy to monitor 5 or 6, projects simultaneously for 2 or 3 years. But when it comes to the end of the day, it is these organizations, the World Bank, USAID, that have the capacity, the resources, the personnel, and not the local civil society. And if we want to talk about vibrance in civil society, then we need to approach complementarity through diversity. Anti-corruption cannot work in a bubble. We need organizations that work on human rights. We need environmental organizations. We need feminist organizations. It's not something we can push alone. And in Paraguay, as in many other countries, we see civic space shrinking. And there's a lot we have to do to try to push that back. And focusing on the same organizations, funding the same projects, and having the same very people leading them, it's a problem. Only 2 more points. I think this will sound a bit radical, but I will ask the international community and donors to not support good ideas. Anyone can propose, let's develop an app. Let's do this, let's bridge this gap. Support living ideas by the evidence that people have been working on that. So many people do not have embassy support, USAID support, but they have been working on those issues for years. And this is when I said that technology can disintermediate, because anyone can propose a great idea and then contract companies to develop things, but those do not bridge do not bridge the gaps that we need. Final point, short point. If we are so capable internationally to incubate startups and companies, can we give ourselves the challenge to incubate anti-corruption organizations? Your expertise could help in that process. We already have Transparency School teaching every year a new generation of anti-corruption practitioners. Can we also push resources to fund the incubation of new organizations that will learn from our mistakes and that will have the administrative capacity as a result that we currently do not have?
So just to try and maybe tackle the 2 questions on the international financial institutions and the... So to tackle the 2 questions, can you hear me? Right, to tackle the 2 questions on the financial institutions and on the issue of internal party democracy, which I think is where you were kind of heading towards. I think the first issue is it is very troubling, Frank, that we're not seeing the kind of leadership from the international financial institutions and the World Bank. I don't personally believe that, and I think we are deeply concerned and worried when the bank and others come offering big loans in countries like South Africa for all the reasons we know. So I'm certainly not going to start that conversation by saying that they're going to be the panacea, but we do know when the bank acts badly, it acts very badly. And that's actually our experience. And so here we are in Washington, D.C., and we ask ourselves that this is the center of power for the international financial institutions, and where are you? What we heard, and I think we can have that open conversation amongst friends, we didn't hear visionary leadership on that first panel. I certainly didn't, and I'm saying that as someone who wants to listen quite acutely and say, so where are you taking it? I didn't hear from our colleague from the World Bank, who occupies a very senior position, a sense that we are all going on some great journey together in terms of tackling corruption. I've heard something that more or less comes from the World Bank slides over time. And I think that suggests that there is a problem at the bank. If the problem rests in the top office, then there's a problem in the bank itself that it needs to confront. Now, our experience in part with challenges around the World Bank in South Africa, and I'm going to tie that into the party funding question, was in particular the World Bank approved loans for the building of one of South Africa and one of the world's largest coal-fired power stations in the late 2000s, with Japanese company with South African connections, Hitachi, who was awarded that contract, and it was co-financing from the World Bank. Now, the cost overruns for that one power plant has gone from about 13 to up to $20 billion has been spent on building this one power plant. And in particular, there was a contract for generators, which is pretty important in the construction of the power plant. Power plant has contributed significantly to what we call power blackouts, or in South Africa, which is a daily challenge. But the governing party was a business partner in that. So the governing party has set up a trust, the ANC, and the trust, in fact, will work together with Hitachi, and they were given the public contract. There were World Bank funds that went into the mix to build a contract. The World Bank investigated it. According to the World Bank's investigation, somehow magically, the World Bank's pile of cash, which was over $3 billion, never got mixed into the bigger pile of cash from which the governing party's company benefited. And I personally find that was the World Bank erred very clearly in that decision about 2016, 2015. But I think it just shows, despite the push from civil society in places like South Africa, the bank certainly showed no proper leadership when it came to that. So, I mean, maybe to go back to Frank's point, what we have seen in South Africa is really important, is after 20 years odd of struggle, we've finally seen a law passed in the last 2 years, which requires political parties to disclose the private sources of funding on a quarterly basis. So we have full disclosure for the very first time. Public funds are given, but the issue of private funding, and frankly, all these corporations I've spoken about in state capture, were likely giving in cash in one way or another, or many of them might have. We wouldn't know, we're none the wiser. And that is also one of the ways that they secured the proceeds of the crime from which they benefited. So we've managed to secure that element of transparency, and I think that's one really important win. The bit that we can't get right in South Africa, and I think it's a challenge for other democracies, is the broader issue of internal party democracy, right? So there's so much you can do as civil society actors. We're not, we're not members of those political parties necessarily, or active office holders in the political parties. And I think there's a whole other thinking around how you promote internal party democracy, because you can have a great constitutional order, brilliant set of rules, but when the breakdown is in the actual structure of the party and that seeps down to a branch level, in South Africa, some of the whistleblowers that are most at danger of being murdered, and there are many people who are murdered, are in fact members of the governing party who speak out against other people who have benefited from corrupt contracts. I do think that this issue of focusing on parties is important, but it's a really tricky issue of internal party democracy, which I think was sort of quite popular maybe 10 or 15 years ago in the discourse, and has pretty much fallen away. But when that doesn't work, particularly in systems where you have a dominant political party, which isn't necessarily going to disappear out of a system anytime soon, and I'm not sitting up here putting forward an argument it should, I'm just reflecting a reality, then I think that remains a massive challenge for us. Thank you.
So I'm going to move to the next round of questions, and Tanu and Cheryl, if there's any thing that you want to respond to from the last round, we'll go to you first. Let me see that show of hands again. I think there was somebody in the last round I didn't get to, so I want to make sure that I do. Okay, right there in the middle. Nope, on this side. You, sir. Yep.
All right, thank you. I'm Ahmad Kisai from Indonesia, USAID Indonesia. Yeah, first off, I like your point on when the window closes, things started to look better, but then things not always better as it is. It's just an experience in Indonesia back in 2018 or something, when things was about to be good, but then things just like an Indonesian activist said something, then the authorities start doing something, and they scrambled for support. This is something that is not there in Indonesian context. I think it's also happening in other places. So having that flexibility, I think this is a very good word. I think this is something that I joined the AID for the past 1 year. I thought it was flexible, but it took me 1 year just to grant a grant. I'm like, so it's the flexibility. I think if we can take that one, really a real action would be interesting to look forward, because also the area of providing support, having a small, I'll say, emergency funding would be interesting to just look things forward, especially in after the window closes. And one more thing I would like to share is about the crowdsourcing. We have the Indonesia Corruption Watch. I've been supporting that before joining the IID, having that monthly kind of support to them. But then once I joined the IID, I talked to RLO. There should be potential conflict of interest if you provide them with all your money, because now they are receiving funds from USAID. I was like, what should I do as an IID personnel that as also Indonesian to support this kind of mechanism? It's very important to have that kind of crowdsourcing mechanism. Thank you.
Yes, good morning. Mike Jajic. I am at George Mason University, where I'm responsible for the course that they offer
Could you
on
keep the mic
peacekeeping
closer?
strategy. Is that on?
It
It
is,
is,
but
but
might
just a
need
little
to
more
speak
direct.
close.
Yep, there you go.
Because of the mask.
Yeah, there you
Yeah.
go.
Okay, I'll start again. Mike Jajic, George Mason University, and I'm responsible for the course they offer on peacekeeping strategy, so obviously I'm going to ask about that. In fact, the slide that you had that showed the case studies didn't deal with peacekeeping, and I think there are two very important, more than lessons, successful methodologies, and peacekeeping has very few successes. So I think it's important to identify them that relate, and in peacekeeping we talk about lessons learned, but they never get applied. So your efforts to develop an assessment methodology are critically important, and you've all mentioned it, and in peacekeeping we have the same problem. We call it the golden hour, a medical analogy, but if you don't effectively come to grips with the problem within about 2 years, you've worn out your welcome. And that's why 50% of peacekeeping missions revert to conflict after 5 years, and the others are intractable conflicts that we're never going to be, well, never is too, but we've been there decades and no exit in sight. So we have to go in with an assessment before before intervening, which is, you're intervening in a different way. And there is as I said, successes are rare, but one comes from Bosnia, and it's the assessment and then the strategy. And Tonu mentioned the need to not just have quick wins, but to have a strategy that dismantled the third entity movement. You don't hear about that as a threat. If in fact the third entity movement had been able to successfully extract Herzegovina from Bosnia and join Croatia back to conflict. But that was prevented, so that's a success. Center of power analysis and targeting in the legal sense, not militarily or kinetically, but putting people in jail. And it looks at the exchanges of power among the network, successful strategy. The second issue,
I just want to mention we have 3 minutes left.
Matt talked about need to use open data to come up with policy solutions. That's a role of think tanks. Hennie talked about investigative journalists. David and Cheryl talked about civil society. And Tonu said, how do we empower them? That's what the civil society triangle did in Kosovo successfully. I won't give you examples. Are you aware of that? Are you aware of COPAT, the Center of that methodology, and B, the civil society triangle, and the way it can answer your question? How do you empower individual? Well, the civil society is not just the civil society triangle.
Great, thanks. In terms of questions, we're going to have to leave it at that. But what I'm going to do is go this direction, starting with you, Tonu. Any reactions to what you just heard, or any final things that you really want to leave this crowd with?
Thanks, Shannon, and thanks for those comments and questions. I think the one thing I think it's worth all of us keeping, not just discussing in this room, but when we step out, is the role of international organizations, international fora, and then how do we continue collaborating and supporting domestic reformers in those political windows of opportunity, right? So just for instance, a lot of people talking about reforms related to dekleptification, whether it's beneficial ownership transparency, whether it's public procurement transparency. So how do we support making those global norms? How do these, there are commitments made at summits for like Summit for Democracy, but how do we really push forward and make them global norms with that kind of accountability is, I think, something we need to think about. At OGP, we keep talking about domestic accountability for commitments made at summits, but I think we need to just be a little more decisive and prescriptive about some of those reforms. And then the second thing is really looking at collaboration across regions, across countries, when these political windows of opportunity happen. So there is a lot of work being done internally by activists, by journalists, by others, but I think how do we then quickly bring in or connect them to coalitions and peers in other countries? Because we've seen this story play out before in a more effective way. At least at OGP, we found this to be very effective, and I feel like there needs to be more resource, more support for such reformers across countries.
All right, hard to pick one or two things, but I just wanted to say, endorse all of the comments and questions were made. I fully concur. I think. I don't want to speak too broadly, but from USAID, since I'm coming out of a particular mission, but I do think some of the priorities on the political party front, particularly with political party finance in particular, that is an area we really do try to focus on and double down. Many times, I was thinking even in Zambia, I think we've been working on the right to information law for 20 years now, and it's just hopefully in cabinet right now, about to be passed. But same with political party finance. I think overall political party support is a broader question that I'll leave to USAID. I do think that's increasingly challenging for us even, and critically important. And then just say the other thing we must do better at donors in these quick transitions is to better coordinate among ourselves. We are terrible at, we need to, when we're in the field, we need to get our home offices on the same page to say let this be, driven by these people in country, because we can all pull countries together that already have very little capacity in very, very different directions, rather than saying we as the development community are together with you, this is how we're going to support you, and this is how you can talk to us, and we're not going to, pull you in many different directions as you are getting pulled in many different directions. So sometimes our various home capitals want to, come in and have a solution for the country, but we're distracting sometimes from the real important work going on, particularly the voice of civil society, ensuring the voice of civil society stays at that table, and then working in really a unified way to come up with priorities and to really be supportive of those priorities and not to support too many things. So let me leave not too many things and stuff there.
Quickly to emphasize, is this on?
Yeah.
Control. Yes, sir. So one thing that I want to emphasize, we don't have the time to talk about this, is that the guide also talks about how I'm mixing words already. Kleptocracies, they infiltrate reformist governments as well. So the whole elite dynamics analysis must be there in the front. They are very good at co-opting, infiltrating, and then taking over. So there is a saying in Spanish, I'll try to translate it, that we try to change everything in order to change nothing. And it's just a status quo reproducing itself and dominating through its many tentacles. So that's the only point I want to emphasize that we didn't have a chance to talk about.
Yeah, maybe just make the final point again around, I think there's some discussion from the transitional justice language around it's about seeing in elements of justice, but it's about the issue of non-repetition, which is important. And I think what we've been in these conversations, which we've seen from many countries long enough, is a repetition of violence against poor people, which is taking place. That violence is perpetrated often by the same actors, whether they are political elites or they are corporate actors. The importance of us to work collectively between countries where those corporations are based, where we have political elites, in order to hold these actors to account and work together, I think is crucial in order to ensure this non-repetition. And so I think we can talk as much as we want about impunity and accountability, but it is fundamentally about prosecutions and justice of the very powerful that we need to see. And I think that's a real challenge, because with that, we open up this window of opportunity. I mean, I think the thought that the window of opportunity is very small is a frightening one, right, for many countries, as if to say, well, it's over. And we need to open that space as wide and as long as possible. And that kind of action opens the breathing room for the rest of us to get on and do the things we need to do in the countries in which we live.
Amazing. So I am not skipping Max. He just declined to say another thing. But I really do want to thank all of you for your robust participation. I really want to thank this panel. I've been on a lot of panels. This has been one of the most interesting panels I've ever participated on. And it's just the quality of work that you all are doing. And I think you've served as such an inspiration for me and for this crowd. So please join me in thanking our panelists.